Now, whereas more is better in horsepower, like I was saying, sometimes less is more. Now, let's give you some ideas about what damping curves and things look like. This is a progressive damping curve. And what this hole is, this is typical of what a hole will do. You have a hole, and you're going to push some oil through it. If you push the oil through it slowly, it'll generate very little damping, if any at all. The faster you start to move the oil through it, the more damping you'll get, and it's actually exponential. So eventually you're cramming this oil through there at a very high speed, and it'll just be locked up. The oil can't pass through the hole anymore, and that's like a hydraulic lock situation, right? Now, do we have any SV650 riders? A couple of SVs. Less techie style forks called damper rod forks, right? Inside those, they don't even have a cartridge. They just have a simple trumpet-shaped device with some holes at the bottom, okay? Those holes are what are controlling damping from the factory. Now, in the old days, you know, let's say they have the damping rod fork. What tuners could do is make these holes bigger or smaller, right? And making the hole bigger or smaller, what we're doing is we really can't change the fact that it's going to have a progressive curve. We can only, but we can move it. So smaller holes will make the shock, and we're going to call this low speed in this area, right? It'll get firmer in low speed, but it'll get worse in high speed, right? So the shape of the curve remains constant. If we made the hole bigger, we do this, okay? So the problem is, with this setup, the bike feels mushy, right? Soft and mushy. And guy complains, oh, my bike feels soft and mushy. Guy welds up these holes and drills them out smaller. He goes, oh, my bike feels good now. But what happens over bumps, right? Bumps feel. It's worse over bumps, right? Feels better, terrible over bumps, right? So he goes, oh, that's no good. Let's go the other way. Now you draw out the holes bigger, soaks bumps great, but now it's mushier than ever. Just absolutely doesn't even work, you know? Soaks a bump, but doesn't even work. So people saw the limitations of this, and then came the advent of the cartridge fork, you know? Everybody was, you know, cartridge fork was the big deal, right? You gotta have a cartridge fork. Well, oddly enough, what people were trying to do was they're trying to put more low-speed feel in. So if you take this hole and we put a shim over it, now we have to force oil past the shim, the spring-loaded shim, right? It's got to get squished through it. So that adds more low-speed damping. We don't have to deal with this initial period of the thing trying to make damping, okay? Now, but oddly enough, people design these pistons in the cartridge forks to still be chucked up with little small holes. So at some point, this thing, the shim is doing the work, but at some point the shim is deflected out of the way, and now the hole is going to take over damping again, and we end up back in this situation, right? So what they're trying to accomplish is, in reality, they're trying to accomplish a more linear damping curve, right? Several years ago, a company called Racetech came with Racetech Gold valve, and they went from taking pistons that had these little tiny holes, and they went to a high flow piston, one with much larger holes, right? And they were able to generate this basic damping curve, a linear damping curve, all right? Shims do all the work. Now the problem with shims is tuners, historically, if the rider complains that the bike doesn't feel firm enough, right? This is where the rider's complaining, remember? Tuner adds more shims, right? And so what they do is, again, you can't change the shape of the curve. You're just going to move it. So what we're doing is this. This is fine as long as you're at a smooth track. So remember, people used to say, oh, well, I have the fork set up for the bumpy track and I have my fork set up for the smooth track, right? This is why, you know, pro teams would carry all kinds of forks, right? Set up different ways, right? All the rider was asking for was for the fork to feel firmer. But what he got was more harshness over bumps. You know, so now this is fine when he's at the smooth track, but when Superstar rider comes back and says, oh my gosh, I'm at Mid-Ohio or Sears Point, and it's like a motocross course, except it's paved, right? Just nothing but chatter bumps everywhere. Well, now his tuner's got to come and take a bunch of shims out of the fork. So now he starts going this way, right? So now we get it to where it soaks bumps, right? We're out here, now we're soaking bumps. But what's happened to the rider's feel? It's all gone away, right? It's back to being a soft, mushy bike that the guy won't be able to ride aggressively. So this is historically kind of what's happened. So you can see where more and less comes in, right, in situations. Well, actually what I tried to accomplish when I started doing forks was, I thought it would be great if I could have both of those. I wanted it to feel firm, but I wanted it to do this, right? Because here's the theory is, all right, if this bike feels firm, right, and we take it to a racetrack and there's no bumps there, this part doesn't even matter, right? It just feels firm and that's good, right? So if we take the thing to a bumpy track now, it still feels firm, right? And yet it soaks bumps. And so the way I came about doing that was a combination of some parts, an Olin Superbike piston and a Racetech Gold valve. We sort of married those and came up with our own part called the action valve. And what we're able to do with it is, instead of having a flat surface that the shims lay on, we have a dished surface. And we can tune, it does this. We can tune a bend into the shims. So this initial pressure makes it harder for the shim to crack open and bleed off initially. And that's where we get this nice rise. But then when it opens, we can, since we've made it feel firm, we can make it very, very soft valving so that it soaks bumps. When you hit a bump, it'll roll over the bump and soak it, right? Now, Olin's Superbike pistons actually have this same feature, this ring around them, but then they have little tiny holes in them when you open them up from the factory. Now, if you're riding on a World GP level and FIM sanctioned track, it's going to be as smooth as this concrete in the warehouse here. They don't deal with the same issues we deal with in America of bumps. So while those forks will feel very firm when you take them out of the box, they won't soak bumps at all. And this has kind of been a problem in the States when people try and run these forks. So, we actually end up taking these parts out and doing something to help them soak bumps internally, right? So the demonstration here is to show you that sometimes less is more. We're still trying to do the same thing. We're bending a stock curve, but we're trying to get it to do what we want it to do. And those are some of the different philosophies you'll run across in the world of tuners, right? From people who revalve stock stuff to guys like me that change all the parts out, right? Now, so that's less is more with the damping curve, right? Now, motorcycle front fork. Same philosophies are all going to apply to damping, but now I'll give you an idea how these things go together. We have two styles of forks. Some people call them upside right and upside down. Our technical terms is conventional and inverted. Conventional fork is chrome tube up. Inverted fork is the fat aluminum tube up, right? The primary purpose of fat aluminum tube up is gives more clamping area for the triple clamps to grab. This makes for more front end rigidity, right? The more area that clamp can grip, the less it's able to do this flexi flyer thing, okay? Which is why if you'll see a late model sport bike, even if it has conventional forks, it'll have a large diameter tube. So for instance, the GSXR 600 will have a 45 millimeter tube, or a ZX6R prior to, up to 2002 will have a 46 millimeter tube. And if you compare this bike, its tube is actually only 43 millimeters. But by having the fat leg up, you get to have a 54 mil on the bottom and 50 at the top. So it's got a lot of area to grip to, right? People have questioned, if one's better for sprung and unsprung mass, and we weigh the parts; they're the same, to us. You have to run a thicker steel tube on a conventional fork. On the inverted forks, they can run a thinner tube, so it's kind of a wash in mass. If you weigh them out, it's very, very small. For road racing, this is best if you can have it, right? Because just for rigidity and feel, it lets you really feel the tire better, right? Now, people run, everybody's seen fork braces or heard of fork braces. They're much popular in older days when they had, thinner, weaker forks. Fork braces can give you many, many, many problems if they're not perfectly machined, fit perfectly, and perfectly installed, because they'll generate a massive stiction in the fork, right? Stiction is a force that we're trying to overcome, the initial force to get the suspension to move, right? Anything that's like binding and making it grab, it's a sort of a trade term that's, sticky and friction, blended together, right? Stiction is the enemy of suspension, number one enemy of suspension. Very little amounts of stiction makes suspension work very bad. So we really work on trying to make low stiction. When we get to setting the bike up, I'll show you how to measure all that in the second part. And we'll get some ideas on when it shows you problems. On your forks, Again, we're going to be looking for oil to leak, and that's, you know, a potential problem. We're looking around the seal area, right? And you'll have, we'll just draw us up an inverted fork here. Don't hold me to my drawing. All right. You have a dust seal on top, which isn't life and death important. Most super sport classes require you to have them. Their primary function is just keeping large stuff out, you know, sticks and birds, right? And the actual oil seal is underneath. Superbike forks and real GP forks don't even run a dust seal because it's just one more thing dragging on the tube, and that's more Stiction. So you won't even find them. They don't even have them on there, right? If this thing ever becomes nicked or damaged in a wreck, right, don't worry about it. You can pry it loose and snip it with a pair of cutters and take it off, and when you get your forks repaired later, you can have your tuner put a new one on. No big deal. So if it's ever nicked or damaged or bent, just cut it off. It ain't gonna hurt. You just, little tiny screwdriver, they'll just pry loose. You know, that's all that's required, right? Fork seal leaks need to be taken, you know, seriously and addressed quickly. And the primary reason is the oil pukes down the leg. It ends up in your brakes, right? No way around it, it's going to end up there. If you get enough oil leaking down your fork leg that it's gotten into your brakes and you can take your brake rotor and wipe it and there's rotor in it, you're going to have to change your brake pads. Because the oil gets into the pad and you can't get it out. You can't just spray it off because the pad's, you know, has a certain porosity, right? As you get the pad hot, the oil will come to the surface every time and it'll inhibit the braking action. So run into a lot of problems with people wailing on their tie downs when they trailer their bike and they drive the bike 1,000 miles, you know, to go to a track day, and they've had it cinched down to where it's smashed solid, and you'll damage your seals that way. But really, there's a lot of slop in this fork, right? The two halves can cock and rock, right? They need to be able to do that because when you're going along 100 miles an hour and you're going to pull on the brake really hard, everything up there is bending and distorting, right? And if everything was fit extremely tight and toleranced, if you had a round tube and you bend it, like in this upper tube, you bend it, there's now an oval there. So there needs to be room for this lower tube to continue passing through, right? So they've actually designed slop into these forks. So when you cinch down on your bike really hard, you're loading that slop out on itself, and one half of that tube is going to be dragging on the seal with great pressure, right? You drive 1,000 miles like that, and you know and it's possible to end up at the track, and you go, it didn't leak at home, and I got here and it leaked, right? So if you have this situation, pry up your dust seal, try and spray out with some cleaner in it. You know, tap the dust seal back in place with a soft rubber mallet. Obviously, no hammers, right? And ride it. May be okay, right? If it's not, you may have to do some sort of, you know, diaper. You know, there's not much you can do on an inverted fork. On a conventional fork, if you're at the track, nobody's there to help you. You know, a nice duct tape diaper around here made out of a nice thick rag will maybe get you by for the weekend, right? If you're stuck. Now, a little tiny bit of oil that's leaked out of your fork will appear like you'll think it's a lot, but a little bit of oil spread out on the, will spread out on the floor a huge distance, and you'll think you've had a catastrophic leak. That's just not true. Second thing is, as soon as you put your axle through the forks, your forks are now one unit. So if your left seal is leaking, that isn't why your bike chatters in left-hand turns, okay? They're completely unrelated. You think of this fork as it's one assembly once the axle goes through, okay? So if you're having trouble with left-hand turns, it's not because the left fork is leaking, right? We've had people get, you know, their minds screwed because they've got a leak and they're worried about it, right? Second thing is, your fork will not stop damping because it's leaking oil. It would have to leak an unbelievable amount of oil for it to quit damping, okay? Inside the fork oil is set to a certain level, all right? Now the reason we do that is we are tuning a second spring in the fork. So if we've got our conventional fork here, and we got our level of oil, there's a column of air sitting on top of that oil. That air is a spring, a pneumatic spring. Air is a naturally progressive spring, and what we're trying to do is tune bottoming resistance, okay? And basically, that spring's rate combined with this air spring as the fork approaches bottom, we kind of want it to take off and do that progressive thing, and that helps keep the fork from going clang on the bottom, all right? Now, so all that's going to happen is if you could have an unbelievably alarming puddle of oil on the floor of your trailer, and this will have dropped 5 millimeters, right? It'll be very, very small. Now, is that going to make any real difference? Not likely. By the time one fork drops 10, a professional rider can tell you, but you're going to have to know that not to be totally alarmed. Biggest thing to be alarmed about, oil in your brakes. Oil, your front tire sat in a puddle of oil. I suggest you change the tire, right? In the trailer, these kind of things, right? You can't just wash the tire and have the oil come out, right? So tire sits in a puddle of oil in the trailer for 1,000 miles, you got to change it, right? Throw it away.